So it's going to be a good one.
So hello and welcome. We're here tonight for another Q&A. My name's Sam Donaghy and I'm joined tonight by my colleague Dean Kinsella from the field team. How are you, Dean?
Fine, Sam. How are you?
Yeah, good. Really good. Seems a long time since we've done one of these, so we'll see how we get on. See if we remember everything.
Sure, Sam.
Just for those joining, and perhaps we may have some new people in tonight. So we run these Q&A sessions every second Monday at 8 o'clock. It's basically open to everybody. We run them on Facebook, YouTube, and also stream on Twitter. The idea is that we have an open forum in terms of questions and answers. Only one rule: no such thing as a stupid question, only stupid answers. So by all means, it's not aimed at experts; it's aimed at all levels. So please don't be afraid to post your questions into the chat room, and that means so that we all have access to it. You'll each see the questions on the platform which you've entered in tonight. So please be kind to anybody that does post and try and help them, because that's really the whole reason for tonight, is to try and sort of improve the common good around the industry. So we'll start off with some questions that we had hanging over from the last session, and while we're going through those, please by all means post the new questions that you have tonight. So we'll start off with the question that we posted out on social media. On a farm, which final circuits require RCD protection in order for you to achieve automatic disconnection of supply? And we actually gave you 4 options. The 4 options I'll just show you on the screen now. So which final circuits on a farm installation require RCD protection? Is it only the final circuits that are on a TT earthing system? Is it only the final circuits that supply socket outlets? Is it only the final circuits that supply socket outlets with a rating not exceeding 32 amp? Or is it all final circuits regardless of the earthing system? Pleased to say that I think most people got this correct when I did a quick trawl across the different platforms sort of late afternoon. So what's our thoughts? What's the guidance or the answer on that one, Dean? Which final circuits need RCD protection?
Right, so what we're going to go for, Sam, we're going to go for ident D for Delta. So what we're looking at there, you're looking at regulation 705.411.1. In the regs, it'll state that in circuits, whatever the type of earthing system, the following disconnection devices shall be provided. And ident 1 says in final circuits supplying socket outlets with a rated current not exceeding 32 amps, and RCD having the characteristics specified in regulation 415.1.1. You've got ident 2, which also comes along with it, in final circuits supplying socket outlets with current rating more than 32 amp, and RCD with a rated residual current operating not exceeding 100 milliamp. And of the last one, ident 3, in all other circuits, RCDs with a rated residual operating current not exceeding 300 milliamp. So, all in all circuits require RCD protection. As you're aware, and most of our audience may be aware, this regulation was introduced in the 17th edition back in 2008, and it was provided enhanced protection from the previous 16th edition regulation, which talked about the requirement for circuits supplying socket outlets except SELV to only require having RCD protection. Obviously the caveat to that is that there's a reduced disconnection time, 0.2 seconds for 230 volt circuits in a farm. So
yeah,
a lot to take on board there, but
spot on. But it's it's fairly clear. It's all circuits, because it talks about a requirement for circuits supplying socket outlets up to 32 amp, a requirement for all other socket outlet circuits, and then a final requirement for all other circuits. So it is all of the final circuits associated with the farm. One follow-up question that often comes along with this is what about the circuits associated with the farmhouse itself, Dean?
The simple answer for this, Sam, is no. This also ties in similar ones for caravan sites where the main office building doesn't fall under them specific requirements. Regulation 705.1 does detail the scope for special occasions to do with 707, and I'll just read it out. It states that rooms, locations and areas for household applications and similar are not covered by this section. So therefore the additional requirements of 705 do not apply to the farmhouse, where the relevance requirements of parts 1 to 6 obviously will still apply as per other installations.
Yeah, absolutely. So 705 that is considered the special location deals with the perceived increased risk associated with that farm environment. So we're talking about generally things like outdoor environment. It's situations where we've got a lot of metalwork in the ground. We may have structures or buildings that don't have a floor, so we've got regular contact with true earth that may be wet because of its environment, and you've also got the situation where we've got livestock as well, which our regs are written for the safety of, and of course they don't read so well in terms of warning labels, so again we have to put more enhanced protection in those areas. So yeah, it's not associated with the farmhouse, which is seen as less of a risk. But that would still have to comply with the general requirements of parts 1 to 6. We've got some other questions that have come in, and one of them is so what about submains on farms? Well, again, if we come outside of the farmhouse, the submains would be considered those other circuits, so they would still require RCD protection, but you're up at the last ident, you're up at the realms of 300 milliamp. So yeah, it is a requirement because it clearly says for all other circuits. So a submain circuit wouldn't necessarily be supplying socket outlets, but it would be a circuit on the farm. So yes, in order to comply with current 7671, it would require it. Just going through some other questions that hung over. Again, this one's very common that we get to the technical helpline. Do I need to be concerned about the metal screws of a plastic light switch not being earthed? So again, people are asking is that perhaps when they're doing an EICR or even when they're doing a new installation. So we might typically be talking about a plastic plate switch going into a plastic back box, and there's no method of earthing those screws that hold the plate switch. But do we need to be concerned about those not being earthed, Dean?
I would say no. Initially, we will go into more as we go along, but what you've got to consider with the screws, it's the actual, I suppose, the potential to be able to grip that screw in the event of it becoming live under fault conditions. And I suppose unless you're Ant-Man, then you might have concerns, but for your standards, human being size, being able to grab something like that, it's probably going to be nigh on impossible. Regulations are in place with regards to this, so you're looking at exposed conductive parts, which the screw may be considered as, which may become live under fault conditions. You're looking at measurements and diameters of capacities to grip it, so 50 mil by 50 mil, so 2 inch by 2 inch. is something that can be easily gripped by a hand, obviously, and obviously that's where you can come in contact with them live parts under fault conditions. Obviously the screw is a lot smaller than that, so it is going to be difficult to do. I suppose some people may argue the case that depending on if the screw is not recessed and it is sort of sticking out and it's got a dome head, you could brush your hand across it. But I suppose most percentages of screws, they do recess into the faceplate, and a lot of them will have caps on them as well on the newer style traditional faceplates where you've got a class 2 and you can pop the cap on it. So no, obviously risk-based assessment, a decision will be made by the installer or by the inspector, depending on whether you are doing it as an EIC or as an EICR. The likelihood of it becoming live and being gripped, probably negligible.
Yeah, so there is, if you look in the chapter 41 about electric shock, there is a permitted exception, isn't there, for those parts that would be considered an exposed conductive part, but because of their size and because of their location, you're unlikely to come into contact where you've got a significant contact. So you may be in the situation where you can't grip it, so it's perceived that again we're less of a risk there. So there is a permitted exception. Another one that's been hanging around is a question related to volt drop. So if the volt drop in an installation is greater than the 5% stated in 7671, can I use equipment if the manufacturer confirms that it will operate safely at the lower voltage? So I think this is addressing in the appendix. We're given guidance that for lighting circuits we shouldn't expect a voltage drop greater than 3%, and for all other circuits 5%. But the question's been asked, if the manufacturer of an item of equipment states that it can tolerate a greater voltage drop, then am I okay to use it, and will it be compliant with 7671?
Yes, obviously always consider manufacturer's instructions. If the information available does make it quite clear, as what you just said in your statement then, Sam, then it is fine to do that. Obviously you've got to be careful with regards to providing documentation to support your decision, and obviously you would attach that to your certificate as part of your O&M information. So if there was anything brought forward later on, post completion, then that information can be readily available for the person to read, which will give assurance that it does comply with the regulations. Yeah. So the regs themselves around the area of volt drop, and also there's some
informative notes in the appendix which concerns the volt drop table. It does say that we can rely on manufacturers' information. So basically, if the manufacturer says their items of equipment will work correctly and safely with a lower voltage, then we would suggest you append that information to your installation certificate, and you'll be absolutely okay and compliant. So it really is that those 3% and 5% figures are generic, and in instances where we need to go better than that or exceed those, then we can rely on the manufacturer's data for confirmation of them.
Yeah, obviously the more information is in BS 7671 in chapter 52, Reg 525, just to obviously back up what we're saying this evening.
Yeah. One more question before we start to take them from the chat room. Do single insulated but non-sheathed bonding conductors need to be installed in conduit or trunking? I guess that question's come about because there is a requirement for non-sheathed cables to be installed in containment, so trunking, ducting or conduit. But what about protective conductors? Do they need to be in containment if they're only single insulated and not sheathed, Dean?
No. Myth, popular, discussion, so on and so forth. But the straight answer is no. They are exempt from having to be installed in conduit, trunking, and similar containment. Obviously, what you've got to consider is that they are suitably sized. So use the adiabatic equation to size your protective conductor correctly. Obviously, you've got to consider other environmental influences for the said bonding conductor. There is a regulation in there, 521.10.1. It does make it clear that non-sheath cables for fixed wiring shall be enclosed in ducting or trunking, but this requirement does not apply to protective conductors complying with section 543 of the regulations. So providing that you meet the requirements of 543 and 544, the answer is no. Obviously, what you've got to then consider is other factors, maybe the earthing arrangements, TNS or TNCS, where there might be a minimum CSA for bonding conductors that the installer would need to have reference to.
So absolutely right. And I think the basic principle is that although we can run these protective conductors and bonding conductors without putting them in containment, they have to be a minimum size which effectively gives them enough mechanical strength to be able to run as single conductors. So that's the principle. So if it's a protective conductor, it needs to be sized in accordance with section 543, as Dean says. That's either by selection or using the adiabatic equation, and if it's a bonding conductor, needs to be sized in relation to section 544. That's associated with equipotential protective conductors. So again, they'll specify minimum sizes, and basically the strength is then associated with the conductor, and there's not a requirement for it to be installed within containment. Okay, we'll have a look in the chat room. So thanks to everyone who's very kindly entered some in there. We'll try and stick to the technical ones if we can, but I'll pick up this first one. The first one I can see is will the new EAS rules apply to existing registered businesses? So the principle is that the new EAS rules are which came into effect on September the 1st of this year, are for new qualified supervisors. So if you're already a registered qualified supervisor within one of our electrotechnical schemes, it won't have an impact. It may have an impact, for example, if you moved from one electrical contractor to another, and the scope of work which you undertook was different, the supervisory role which you undertook was different, then the new rules would apply, because you'd effectively be treated as a new QS in your new environment if it differs from where you've originally been assessed as before. But in general, the principle is that it's for new QSs that were appointed or applied for the role after September the 1st. One thing to say, and I'm going to mention it at the end of tonight's session, is we actually did a very good webinar. It was very well received. I think there were over 1,000 people on the night watched it, which was actually this time last week. So that webinar is now available to view on demand, and so would be well worth a watch. So if you go onto the website and go into the events area, you'll get into the on demand section, and you'll be able to review that webinar at your leisure. Very, very informative, and as I say, was very well received on the night. So hopefully that's answered your initial question, but it's I really want to plug that EAS webinar, because that'll answer a lot more questions as well.
Yeah, there's also, just a note, Sam, on the niceic.com, the public domain, under the contractor subheading, on the subheading Essentials, is actually documentation present in there as well, with some podcasts and some frequently asked questions and the EAS guidance for NIC contractors. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll talk at the end. But there's, it was quite a big change came into effect. It's not just for the NIC schemes. It's across the electrotechnical industry. So it involves all of the other competent person scheme providers and electrotechnical scheme providers as well. And so that the real aim was to try and improve the level within the industry, so to raising the bar again, to try and across the board for the common good, to improve areas. So that was the whole idea of why it was introduced. Yeah, please take some time out to have a look at that presentation, because it explains a lot. Looking into the chat room, let's have a look. I think we talked about the submains within farms, in that, yeah, outside of the farmhouse they would still need to comply with section 704. What code for a circuit using an RCD spur or RCD sockets for additional protection when we believe that they don't offer additional protection anymore? Interesting in that when we believe, it's not. I think we've come out with a statement. It was in our Connections magazine a while ago. There was a lot of miscommunication about this, but we as an organisation believe that RCD sockets and RCD spurs can still provide the additional protection requirements of a typical 30 milliamp RCD. So that's a situation that I think has been sort of spoken about by others who don't believe. We're hoping that it's clear that currently in 7671 those 7288 devices, RCD spurs and RCD socket outlets, have been removed from the list of equipment that can be used for additional protection. But our belief was that that's just a mismatch between the 7671 and the 7288 spec, which we hope has been rectified now. So we're hoping in Amendment 2 that they will be reintroduced back into the list of equipment that can be used to provide additional protection. As I say, I think we covered it in one of the Connections magazine articles a while ago, but our view is that you can still use RCD socket outlets and RCD spurs to provide additional protection. We've got another question. What protection, if any, is required on a domestic install where a consumer unit is mounted on a vertical wall and it's mounted stood off from the wall? Would instrument strip be applied to the void at the back of it? Generally, in a domestic install, if we're talking about fire protection, then that's one fire compartment. So you don't normally need to provide fire seals when you break into, for example, plasterboard partitions or internal walls within the dwelling. But it would be worth checking with the structure of the building and ensuring that you're not breaking any fire barriers, because obviously if you do break a fire barrier seal, then you need to repair it back to the same amount. But generally when we're talking about domestic It's the building itself forms, if we're talking about a typical dwelling, a typical house, the building itself forms a single fire compartment, and we don't need to seal those internal walls. So hopefully, I think that's where you're coming from with that question. I'll just read it again. What protection, if any, is required on a domestic install where a consumer unit is mounted on a vertical wall and it's stood off from the wall? Should intrumescent strip be applied to the void at the back of it? Only if that wall that is a fire barrier, which it's highly unlikely within a single domestic dwelling. Would you add anything to that, Dean?
No, I was just thinking with regards to saying that the fuse board is obviously on some sort of bracket. It's not fixed to the wall in general. Is that what they're saying, Sam?
It just says mounted off a wall, but I guess then we're talking about we'd still need to come out with cables from that wall. So effectively there'll be a hole in that wall somewhere, either to mount the consumer unit or to allow the final circuit cables to come through for connection to the consumer unit. But as I say, generally that domestic wall wouldn't be a fire barrier generally, and so therefore wouldn't need to be sealed, because it's, although we have got that regulation that tells us we need to fire seal to the same degree as the structure if we are going to break it. Typically in a domestic, the internal walls wouldn't be fire barriers. Again, I'll plug it at the end of the show. We did 2-part webinar, very good, about fire engineering and the associated protection within 7671. That is, and those 2 webinars, parts 1 and 2, are again available to watch on demand.
Yeah, just going back to the fuse board, Sam, obviously the hole coming into the back of the fuse board, obviously a lot of them come with pre-knockouts. If the knockout is substantially larger than the amount of cables that are going to enter the fuse board from that entry point, best to make the hole smaller, to reduce that impact on the fire rating, rather than having a large knockout in the back for only a small amount of cables. And I guess the only consideration with regards to dwellings is that you were saying on domestic is with regards to where there might be multiple occupancy within there, like a flat split up where there might be no fire barriers present. It might have been installed to older regulations, not just the electricity regulations, but to other parts, structure and the likes.
Yep. Okay, we've got a question that I'll take on board, but I'll need to go and look in some reference material. So, would the armour of a 16mm squared 4-core SWA circuit fed from a P&E supply have a sufficient CSA to be used as a bonding conductor as well as a CPC? I'll need to go and look at the size, but also we often advise against using the armouring as a bonding conductor because of the potential thermal effect that can have in terms of obviously if the armour's carrying current and heats, it can have a detrimental effect on the current carrying capacity of the other cores. So in general we try and avoid using the armouring as a bonding conductor. Not the same that there's no such exemption for using it as a circuit protective conductor, because that's only carried current for a very short time until the protective device operates. But yeah, in general we try and steer away from using the armouring as a bonding conductor. But I will check the sizing. There is a table. The one that I'd go for is there's a table in Guidance Note 1 which has got all of the standard sizes for SWA varying in cores, 2, 3 and 4 core I believe, and it will tell us whether the armouring's large enough to act as a protective and bonding conductor. Okay, if we come down a bit further, Do you need to have a Sitting Guilds 291901 qualification to be able to install an EV charging point at a domestic property, or just have your 18th and being a qualified electrician? It's a good question. At the moment, there's no specific requirements for EV charging, so within our schemes it would just come under the competence for the relevant scheme. So for example, if it was if you were assessed and enrolled on a domestic scheme, then you would be assessed and approved for installing vehicle charging in a domestic installation, and likewise if you were on the approved contractor scheme, you'd be assessed and approved for installing vehicle charging in non-domestic installations. So there's no specific qualification requirement at the moment. There's a lot of focus on EV charging. You may be aware that the government did a study to look at the general state of vehicle charging, because obviously they're keen to roll out vehicle charging across the country and improve the infrastructure. And so one of the things that they did was looked at how it was currently being installed, and the state of those current installs. So there was a big survey undertaken earlier in the year. The results were published around the summertime. So in the future there may be more of a focus on, we don't know for certain, but right now there's no specific qualification requirement to be able to install vehicle charging. We do it under the basic assessment of the different schemes.
Yeah, just going back to the one earlier, Sam, with regards to the bonding conductors in Guidance Note 1, the IET, I've just found some tables there on page 55 in chapter 3. So there's information here to do with the main protector bonding, conductors and sizing, etc. So that might be something that you were mentioning beforehand.
Yeah. Okay. Another one we've got, Regulation 419.3. If you provide supplementary bonding for a circuit that doesn't meet disconnection times, what about the rest of the installation that is likely to have an increase in potential? Okay, so 419.3 is where we can't meet the disconnection times. So quite often on installations, generally larger installations that are very close to the supply transformer, so effectively our incoming ZE there's a distance from the supply transformer. So basically it's situations where your incoming ZE is already higher than the maximum permitted ZS for your protective devices at the origin. Section 419.3 covers the situations that you have to do to be able to still comply. So in those situations where we can't meet the ZS of the protective device because it's so low that our incoming ZE already is too high for it, then we can apply supplementary bonding, generally in the intake room. So in the situation where our intake, all of our extraneous conductive parts and our exposed conductive parts would be provided with supplementary bonding, such that we do still have an overcurrent device which will eventually operate. It just may not operate in time for us to achieve the required disconnection specified in chapter 41. So we have to provide additional supplementary bonding in that intake area to ensure that while we've got a fault, we won't have any potential differences between any conductive parts which are likely to cause somebody in there to have a electric shock issue. As I say, the protective device will eventually go, and it's just for that sustained time. So typically we're going to be, greater than our 5 seconds or our 0.4 seconds, depending upon what size circuit. Going outside of that, then our protective devices will then tend to be smaller, and so hopefully we will start to be able to achieve the ZSs of those final circuits perhaps that are actually fed from the incoming area. So that supplementary bonding get out, if you like, is only really associated with problems at the origin. Once you come away from the origin, you'll tend to have smaller current rated devices, which even though that high ZE, you should still be able to achieve the ZSs of them. So it tends to not be a problem on the sub mains or even the final circuits that are fed from that origin location. It tends to really only be a problem with the overcurrent protective devices that are on the supply cables to the installation. So yeah, supplementary bonding in that intake area, but then going away from that with our sub mains and our final circuits, they should be lower current, which means then we can have a protective device with a lower nominal rating, and that will give us a bigger ZS to achieve, so hopefully we won't have the same problem on the circuits that leave that origin.
Yeah, from an installation point of view on that, Sam, I would also add it's important to check the adequacy of the earthing before you take on the project, so you can make allowances for such situations as been mentioned just now.
Yeah, it's certainly one of those ones. I mean, it's something that's often known on a new installation where we're we've got known characteristics about the supply that's going to be coming in. But yeah, as Dean quite rightly says, quite often if an installation's gone through a major upgrade, so now it needs a larger supply, that's when that problem can arise as well, because the incoming supply can have vast different characteristics from what was the original supply, and again we might find that our ZE, our incoming ZE, has now gone up, and so now our ZS of our devices at the origin doesn't meet disconnection times anymore, and so because of that increase in demand we might have to provide that supplementary bonding at that point within the area associated with the origin. But yeah, it is 419.3 is a reg that not a lot of people know about and not a lot of people have to use. It really is in those instances where, because of the characteristics of the supply, you can't meet the ZS of your protective devices. You're not going to achieve the required disconnection, so you are allowed to provide that supplementary bonding, which its purpose is to limit the magnitude of any touch voltage until your protective device does operate, even though it might be outside of the required disconnection time. It will eventually operate, and you've just got to ensure that for the time it takes to operate, everything that's simultaneously accessible within that intake area is bonded, so that the magnitude of any potential touch voltages is reduced to 50 volts or less.
Yeah, 415.2 obviously gives you the more information to back up 419.3 as well.
Okay, we're rapidly, we'll try and pick up another couple just before we go, but we will. I do appreciate, thanks very much for everybody that has contributed, and we do keep the questions that we haven't got round to try and answer them at a later date. So I'm just looking, there's somebody that's very kindly has agreed that they talked about the EAS webinar. The webinar for the EAS was great. Thanks, really informative and very helpful. So there you go, there's a very good independent engineer specifying that was good. So for those of you that have got some EAS questions or just want a general intro into what's happened with regards to the electrotechnical assessment specification, please grab a look at that webinar. So we'll take another one. Why don't they make a 16mm twin and earth cable with a 10mm earth included with a 16mm and not have to run a separate 10mm for a submain? Good question. They do. It is actually a permitted variants, so they do 16mm with 6 and with 10mm. Perhaps not so common, but it can be if you shop around. There's no requirement that says there's no exemption that says you can't. So it might just be a case of getting hold of it from different cable manufacturers. But as with any product, they'll only go for whichever one's the most popular.
Yeah, I guess it's the suitability of the cable as well, Sam. Obviously, it's been designed that way, so it depends on the earthing system and main protective bonding, whether there's a need to have an increased CSA for the CPC.
Yeah. So I can understand where the 10mm coming from, because that will satisfy your minimum for PME and also your minimum for TT and TNS. But yeah, it's certainly out there. So one other one that so again, this is another fairly common one. With consumer units getting larger and larger, where there isn't enough space to mount it horizontally, is it okay to mount the consumer unit vertically? What's your thoughts on that, Dean?
Again, with regards to locations being small on the newer builds nowadays and other areas, I guess you're referring back to the manufacturer's instructions to ensure that they've agreed that it is safe to install it at a different angle than horizontal, i.e. vertically. Obviously, obtain the documentation from the manufacturer, confirm that the mounting orientation is suitable, attach it to your certificate to support your decision on the fixing of the switchgear. I think that's probably the best and simplest way and only way of ensuring suitability of the installation for where it's being mounted on a vertical axis as opposed to horizontal.
Yeah, it's really a case of there's nothing that prevents you in 7671, but it would come down to confirmation through manufacturer's instructions. And experience tells us that a lot of the individual components, breakers, etc., that can often be used in three-phase distribution boards are mounted on that vertical plane anyway. It just tends to be that in a three-phase board the orientation tends to be vertical rather than a domestic consumer unit where it's horizontal. So it's possible, but confirmation would need to be sought from the manufacturer to ensure that that it doesn't, for example, create heat problems by putting it in a different orientation, because obviously we've got that issue with heat rising. So if we stack the protective devices on top of each other, there is going to be a bit of residual heating from the devices below them.
I guess the only concern is obviously gravity. Will electricity be able to move as fast enough as you'd like it to? I think if you did mount it on the side, Sam.
I think it's extremely fast. I don't think we'd have any issues there. And lastly, after changing a consumer unit where no final circuit cables were replaced, in the schedule of inspections on the EIC, what should be recorded for cables installed in walls or partitions being installed in the prescribed zones when the cable routes are unknown? So again, something we get asked from time to time. Somebody's done a board change and they now come to complete the installation certificate, and they're being asked about cables which they haven't installed, and so they can't really confirm whether they've been installed in prescribed zones or not. So what's the guidance on completing that schedule of inspections in that situation, Dean?
Well, first of all, I'd like to just put a bit of background to it. It's important that obviously the certificate is accurate for the description and the scope of work carried out. So initially on that first page, make it quite clear what your description and the extent of the work is. So when you come to your inspection schedule, the inspection schedule is only relevant to what work has been carried out, which has been recorded correctly or accurately on page 1. Therefore, what you will find on example of fuse board change, there'll be a number of items in inspection schedule that will not apply to that scope of work that's being carried out. For example, a fuse board change, no cables have been run or installed, therefore it's not part of the scope of work, therefore naturally an NA would fit into that item within the inspection schedule as other ones would do also.
Yeah, it's absolutely spot on. I think some people get confused that the installation certificate has to reflect the installation. It doesn't. It has to reflect the work that's being done and that's being certified. So in the case we've talked about, the work that's been done has just been the consumer unit change. So it would be quite acceptable to put not applicable against things outside of the consumer unit. So for example, cables. So that's really where you need to be nice and detailed when it comes to completing that box which says extent of work covered by the certificate. Because for example, you might say consumer unit change with test only of existing final circuits. And so that helps to make it clear that you're not certifying the existing final circuits, you're only testing them as part of the reconnection if that's what you're being engaged to do, but you're making it clear that you haven't installed them, and therefore you can quite rightly put not applicable into a lot of the boxes of the scheduled inspection. I think people are always concerned about putting not applicable because they think, well, why would they be asking me that question if it's not applicable? But that scheduled inspection should always be completed in association with the work that's been undertaken. So don't do it looking at the installation and trying to complete it. Do it based on what work have you done, and then just complete the installation certificate accordingly.
Yeah, so you'd have two options in there, Sam. There'd be the tick to confirm it meets the regulations, or it'd be an NA because it doesn't fall within the scope of the work carried out.
Yeah.
So it's as simple as that. Does that apply to what I've done? Yes or no?
Yeah. And so if you wanted to, if it was relevant, you could include your exemptions in that box which talks about details of the work covered by the certificate. If there's something specifically that you want to exclude, there's no problem with doing it in that part of the certificate.
Yeah, I suppose the other thing to add on to that would be, if you do feel a bit edgy about putting NA and you do tick it, then just on a continuation page add a few notes relevant to that part of the certificate and that particular item number, just to give some supporting evidence as to why it is a tick or an NA.
Yeah, there's a lot of comment in the chat room, and it's good to see people sort of saying about about the concerns that they've got with some of the work that they come across, and that's one of the reasons why the EAS document has come into, it's been done on behalf of the whole industry, so we contribute to the EAS document, as do other competent person scheme providers, as do qualification organisations like City and Guilds and EAL, and also other relevant bodies like the IET, like the MHLCG, who look after the PRS legislation. So there's lots of interested bodies that are contributing towards that EAS document, and the whole idea was to raise the standard with it across the industry. So a lot of people sort of saying that things we totally agree with. I see that there's one engineer saying that people understood, general public understood not to touch gas, but we'll have a go at electrics. Yeah, unfortunately that is the case. Gas is far more regulated, and that's because of the danger is much greater. But yeah, it's something it's made a step forward. There probably will be other steps in the future, and things may change for better, with the whole idea of trying to, for the common good. That's the whole approach, that we're trying to raise the standard. So thanks very much for those comments, and we do agree with them in general. I just want to show you or make you aware there are a couple of wire webinars. So when we run these Monday night Q&A sessions on the other weeks, so for example next week there'll be a Wednesday webinar, so there'll be a wire webinar for an hour at 8 o'clock. The only difference being that you have to pre-register for those. So I can see that next Wednesday on the 17th we've got the 10th edition of our coding clinic, where we're looking at situations and installations that have been provided to us and giving advice and guidance on coding from an EICR principle. And then a fortnight after that, on the 1st of December, we've got a webinar associated with one of the guys from our customer relations team, one of the engineers that gets involved in complaints, looking at common causes for complaints and how to avoid them. So those are the live webinars coming up. We've also got a large number of existing webinars on the system that you can now view on demand. So there's over 20 wire webinars on a range of subjects, including electric vehicle, supplies to hot tubs, exporting PME to outbuildings, fire engineering, as we talked about earlier. So there's a whole range of, as I say, over 20 wire webinars that are available to view on demand. So please, if you do get the time and you want some further information, have a look at those that are available. We tend to keep them for about a year, so you'll see that they go back to November last year, and then after a year we tend to archive them.
So probably watch the historical ones first.
That's a good shout.
Lose sight of them.
That's a very good shout, actually. Perhaps look at, good shout, Dean, in that look at the older ones first to see if there's some interest or some relevance to what you're doing there, and look at those first, because they will be the ones that will disappear first. Okay. Unfortunately, we're going to have to call it a halt then. We're supposed to only go for half an hour, and some people get upset when we go longer because they say that they miss the stuff that we do at the end. So we do apologise for that, but it's I guess you can put it down to our keenness. It's the first night back, but it is, I think we've all got that inquisitive engineering gene, and quite often we start talking about something at 5 o'clock and we're still talking about it at 8 o'clock. So I think we're fortunate in that we're in one of those industries that there's always something new. Nobody knows everything. There's always something you can learn. So it's that's perhaps why we talk and overrun these half-hour sessions, wouldn't you say, Dean?
Definitely, Sam. I'm just going to add one more thing to that. Just going back to the SR CDs, the Spring 2021 Connections magazine, in the technical section, page 62, which we discussed earlier, and also Guidance Note 8 in Chapter 9 discusses more about suitability of armouring and other materials for use as a circuit protective conductor and for bonding as well.
That's great. Yeah, cheers. Thanks for that, Dean. So Dean, you see, Dean saves me that, it's really good, and hey, we definitely learn off each other. I can honestly say, I've been around for maybe too long now, but I'm still, every day I'm learning something. Somebody will tell me something or ask me a question that makes me go and learn, and I think that's that's one of the reasons why we like this industry as well, in that there is always something to learn, there's always something to find out about, which is good.
Yeah, every day's a school day, Sam.
Every day's a school day, definitely. Well,
that's why we wear our shirt and ties.
On that note, we'll say goodbye. Thank you very much to everyone who's contributed tonight, both with questions and with the answers that they've given to everyone. As I say, apologise if we didn't get round to your question, but we will trawl through them, and that's what we'll use to start us off next time. So please do keep those questions coming in. and hopefully we'll see you again in a fortnight. If you haven't done already, think about registering for the online webinar next Wednesday. That will be on Coding Clinic for EICR issues, and please have a look at the online webinars that you can view on demand. Any last thoughts from you?
Great evening. No, I think it was a fantastic one tonight. Some good stuff to get stuck into.
Yeah, definitely.
Gets the cogs working again.
Well, for the 419.3, that that's one of my, if I'm honest, that's one of my favourites, because it's a situation where not a lot of people know it, and we do get a lot of calls where people say, I can't achieve the ZS, the incoming ZE is already too high, and they think there's nothing I can do. Well, it's, as I say, it's not a very well known section, but that section 419.3 is specifically for those situations where you can't meet the disconnection times of chapter 41. What can I do? And that talks us through it, so that's very good. Okay.
Yeah, no, fantastic, Sam.
All right, well, once again, thank you very much for this evening and contributing, and we'll hopefully see you again in a fortnight.
Take care, stay safe.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye bye.